So welcome to this special one-day conference at MacDiarmid at 100. My name's Scott Lyle, and I'm co-organiser of the conference with Dr. Jim Benstead, and Jim's going to talk in a moment as well, so he'll be able to say hello too. So the conference is being run under the auspices of the Scottish Revival Network, which I'm the PI for. My co-investigator, my partner for that is Dr. Michael Shaw at the University of Stirling. He's a lecturer in Scottish literature at the University of Stirling, and Jim is our research assistant. And the network we've had quite a few events thus far. This is a special event that really we've added in, essentially, and I'll talk about the context as to why we've done that in a moment. But the purpose really of the Scottish Revival Network is to think about the notion, the idea of revival in Scottish literature and culture from around about the 1880s, the end of the 19th century, up to the 1940s and 1950s in the 20th century, and think about the ways that the Celtic revival or the Fin de Siècle revival at the end of the 19th century actually has kind of links into the Scottish Renaissance movement of the 20th century. As I say, we've had several events so far. We've got a couple still to go after this event. Our next event after this event is called Global Scottish Revival. That'll probably happen later on in the autumn, so do look out for that if you're interested. Please do come along. You can find us on Twitter, and please follow us on Twitter at Scott Revival. And if you want to find out more about our network, you can check out our website, which is revival.scot. So please get in touch if you have any questions about the network or you want to follow us on Twitter, then that would be great. So the context of today's event, MacDiarmid at 100, I suppose to some extent are made clear by the title alone. Christopher Murray Grieve was born in 1892 in Langham, small town on the Scottish borders, but Hugh MacDiarmid, his most famous, not his only, but his most famous pseudonym, was born really in 1922, in August 1922, first in the pages of the Scottish chapbook, Grieve's, one of Grieve's many magazines, little magazines, in a story called Nisbet, which Alan Raic is going to talk much more about in his paper in this session. So partly we wanted to think about MacDiarmid in that moment in 1922, and think about also what that means now, both in relation to Scottish literature, in relation to the idea of Scottish revival and Scottish Renaissance, but also in relation to the idea of international modernism and MacDiarmid's place in that. So I think what we'll try to do today is situate MacDiarmid in that moment, a moment that was a big moment for international modernism, clearly 1922. The Innis Mirabilis, of course, of modernism, the publication of The Wasteland, the publication of Ulysses. And MacDiarmid takes his part really in that great moment for modernism. So we'll think about that today, but we'll also think about where MacDiarmid's studies have come to today and how new ideas and theories change and shift how we view MacDiarmid. So that will become apparent as we get into the panels. So I'm going to hand over to Jim now to talk a bit about that.
Thank you. Cheers, Scott. We've got two panels today. The morning panel has the theme readings and revisions, with our panelists' papers considering subjects such as the non-dictionary sources of the Watergore, MacDiarmid's objectives for the Scottish chapbook, his use of cosmological imagery in the Scots poems of the 1920s, and the first text published under his name, the short dramatic work Nisbet, an interlude in post-war Glasgow. The afternoon panel is subtitled Concepts and Peripheries, and we'll see our panelists engage with the questions that arise when writing a biography of Christopher Murray Grieve, and with the archipelagic vision present in Memoriam James Joyce, as well as reassessing MacDiarmid's poetics and politics in the context of recent work on decolonisation, and demonstrating how the source materials MacDiarmid borrowed from in his work can themselves be thought of as being in some sense peripheral. The morning panel focuses more on MacDiarmid's early work, while the afternoon panel is more concerned with his later work. But we also intend to challenge the traditional critical binaries that consider these two parts of MacDiarmid's career as somehow separate. And instead, we hope to trace out the continuities that run through MacDiarmid's career as a whole. So to move on to some housekeeping before we start the first panel. Each panelist is going to speak for between 15 and 20 minutes. And once all of the panelists have spoken, we'll open up the discussion for questions. If you wish to ask a question, please add it to the Q&A whenever you like, and we'll come back to it once the panelists have finished speaking. You can access the Q&A through a button at the bottom of the Zoom window. Alternatively, you can also click the raise hand button once we're in that question and answer session at the end, and we'll bring you into the conversation. The chat is open as well for more general comments and discussions. Closed captions have also been enabled and can be accessed through another button at the bottom of the Zoom window. Each panel will be recorded. Zoom should have already told you about this, and shared on our YouTube channel. There's a link to our channel in the chat if you would like to subscribe to it. We expect our first panel to run through to midday. We'll then have a 2-hour break for lunch before reconvening for our second panel at 2 p.m. If you haven't already signed up for that, there's a link to do so in the chat. So moving on to the first panel of the day. The first paper will be given by Professor Patrick Crotty. Patrick is a critic, editor, and translator. In addition to many essays, articles, and reviews on the poetry of Ireland, Scotland, and Wales, he has published Modern Irish Poetry, an anthology, and the Penguin Book of Irish Poetry. He is currently editing the complete collected poems of Hugh MacDiarmid. Patrick is Emeritus Professor of Irish and Scottish Literature at the University of Aberdeen, where he taught both on the English and Celtic and Anglo-Saxon programmes. His paper is titled Chittering Lits, Non-Dictionary Textual Sources in Sangshaw and Pennywheat, with particular reference to the Watergall. So, Patrick, that's over to you.
Right. Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Everyone can hear me? Right. Okay. Now, we'll begin by saying that there's been much said about MacDiarmid and dictionaries, but dictionaries have been fetishized to some degree in MacDiarmid. I mean, they were just they were another source of lexis for him, but he looked for lexis sort of everywhere. It was maybe available in a more condensed conglomeration or whatever in dictionaries. But one of the things I'd be kind of looking at or trying to explore today is the way that dictionaries are a function of a wider interest in language. Norman McCaig famously said to MacDiarmid, "Chris, you're not interested in language at all. You're just interested in vocabulary." And you know, maybe that is true. But anyway, here we go. Oh gosh, here we would go if my yes, next slide, Jim, please. That was the title, right? Right. Okay. Now, the story begins with Sir James Wilson, Lowland Scotch, as spoken in the lower Strathearn district of Perthshire, and that's really used only for 2 poems: the Watergaw on the Bloward and the Skelly. Then there's Jemison, and as you'll see, and as you know, it was published in 2 volumes, and then there were 2 equally large supplementary volumes in 1825. From 1879 to 82, there was a new edition, a revised edition. It's always taken for granted that this is the one MacDiarmid used in Montrose. I think it may well have been, but I think it needs further exploration. Are we absolutely sure he used the so-called Paisley edition? One of the things that has made me want to go back and revise everything I've said about Sangshaw and Pennywheat is that when he goes back to Jameson, to the 4-volume Jameson in the reading room of the British Museum in 1932, he goes straight for the additional, the new headwords. Almost everything he uses that's from the larger Jameson in the poem Scots Unbound, is from that square bracketed set of additions to the 1879 to the Paisley edition. Okay, then there's one that's not been spoken of, the Rossburghshire Word Book by George Watson, but important poems come straight out of that. One of the most visionary of the early lyrics is Ex Verbibus. It is constructed directly out of bits and pieces, out of one phrase, and then bits and pieces of other entries in George Watson. The Socks of the Roy Hugh Hawk comes out of an appendix to it, and also the drums in the Watergate lyric in A Drunk Man comes from there. And the interesting thing about that, of course, is that MacDiarmid was already a Scots poet when Watson's a word book came out. It's essentially a dictionary. But I think it's maybe not sufficiently understood that MacDiarmid's exploration of Scots coincides with the resurgence of scholarly interest in Scots on the part of lexicographers and such harmless drudges. Right, then there's Walter Gregor's The Dialect of Banffshire with a glossary of words not in Jameson's dictionary. He begins to use, he uses it in Locht, he uses it in Morning, and then he uses it in A Drunk Man and in the Lucky Bag. Later in the 1930s, there would be other dictionaries, but in Sancho and Pennyweep, these are the dictionaries. Next slide, please. Now, Jameson, he doesn't use dictionaries just for the headwords. He uses dictionaries for a lot of the explanatory material he finds therein. For instance, Jameson makes reference to George Thompson's challenge to Robert Burns to make a better version of the Bonnie Bruchid Lassie, which is a traditional song. And the titular version, the Bonnie Bruchid Lassie, had become somewhat standardized when Franz Joseph Haydn made a setting for it in 1792 for Thompson. MacDiarmid really responds to that story and rises to the famous song connector's bait and kind of tries to put Burns in his place. He dispenses with the song, but writes instead a short cosmic page lyric where the focus moves down the sky, the social order on the page, until it reaches the Tear Street child of the title, who turns out to be planet Earth. In other words, MacDiarmid is responding to an anecdote rather than to any particular set of linguistic exhibits. Reading comes, time to go into it, but it comes from another anecdote under Read Day in Jameson. In Mysie's Bed comes from a quotation from Galt, which he makes into a verse and then makes another stanza based on the rhyme that he has sculpted. There are no rhymes. He just breaks the Galt sentence into lines and uses each line ending for the rhyme in the second stanza, which he contributes. Right. Also, there is evidence that in Pennyweep, he's already using Chambers's 20th century dictionary, which I actually saw in his hands in Brownsbank in August 1974. But there is evidence that Sea Serpent is to a degree based on that source. Next slide, please. The Bonnie Bruchid, there's songs and ballads. There are more ballads, perhaps. It's often been observed that he uses the ballad stanza in Sancho and Pennyweep, but he also makes references to ballads, some of them well known, like Jamie Douglas, When We Came Through Glasgow Tune, We Were a Comely Sight to See, My Good Lord in Velvet Green, and I Myself in Cramacy. And notice one of the things he does there in the Bonnie Bruchid Bairn is he switches the gender, he flips the gender. He loves doing that. He's extremely interested in gender. in Sancho and Penny Peep and the early poems anyway. Servant Girl's Bed, he uses the Talis Spales, that there is no, the verb spale doesn't appear in any of the dictionaries available to MacDiarmid. It doesn't go into a Scots dictionary until the SND, and the SND finds it in Hugh Miller. If you go to the Hugh Miller source, he was a famous geologist and folklorist, as I think you'll know. But if you go to the Hugh Miller source, you'll find not just that MacDiarmid uses not just some of the language from the Ballad of False Jamie, and a spale and the candle turned to the bride, and a coffin louped for the fire. He also uses the backstory of sex and betrayal to construct his own lyric. And then famously, as a Metayant the Kearney, Jenny Nettles, singing till a Bernie, Robin Rattles Bastard. Now, it is true that this ballad is in Jameson, but that ballad, it's ubiquitous. It's in Heard Songs, Ancient and Modern. It's in Ramsay's The Tea Table Miscellany. He could not have avoided it, but there are aspects of the poem which seem to me to be not just taken from the ballad and an associated more polite song, but they seem to have come almost without doubt from the discussion, a three-page discussion of Jenny Nettles by Robert Chambers in his The Songs of Scotland Prior to Burns with the Tunes. You can find that on pages 397 to 399 if you don't believe me. The fact that this song is quoted in Jameson is not the end of the story. MacDiarmid appears to have known much more about the song than that. Right, other songs and ballads. Eau Claire de la Lune is based on, to a degree, on Eau Claire de la Lune, the 18th century, the still popular 18th century French children's song, which is kind of a half-knowing narrative of sexual encounter. While MacDiarmid's suite of lyrics makes no direct reference to the song that gives them their title, Eau Claire de la Lune nevertheless remembers the song in its not fully comprehending commentary on starting revelations by moonlight. And also you'll notice that the spinning top image of 2, when the world soon is appearing, and the title of 3, The Man in the Moon, may be thought to evoke something of the child world of that song. Under the Greenwood Tree refers, I think, not just to the pastoral song in As You Like It, but to Thomas Hardy's uncharacteristically idyllic novel of 1872. And MacDiarmid writes uses the title ironically, but uses sort of a knowledge of the songs to effect that irony by writing a much darker lyric. Readeen uses Hey Nonny Nonny. I put Shakespeare down. Hey Nonny Nonny appears all over the place in songs and ballads, not only in England, but also in Scotland, to be fair, and Ireland and elsewhere. Okay, next slide. He draws on all kinds of stuff he just happened upon. I Heard Christ Sing is based on the chapters about Christ dancing and singing in the Acts of John, the 2nd century Acts of John. This was a script which was suppressed by the church. It was, as you can see, the famous scholar M.R. James published a scholarly edition of a new translation, the Apocryphal New Testament being the Apocryphal Gospels, Acts, Epistles, and Apocalypses, with other narratives and fragments newly translated. It's interesting that in the Acts of John, Christ dances as well as sings. In MacDiarmid's version, he just sings. Right, over Inzibar becomes the excuse for a kind of an almost nightmarishly intense evocation of a farmyard. But it came from a nod spelling, perhaps a misspelling of over Inzibar, which is a farm situated at Inzibar, just outside the village of Oakley. a few miles from Dunfermline town, and but he appears to have come across that in the transactions of the Highland and Agricultural Society of Scotland, and Country Life is a reference to country life. In other words, the magazine founded, the magazine of that name, which was founded in 1897 and which is still, unfortunately, flourishing. The title of MacDiarmid's poem is a sardonic reference to the name of the magazine that specializes in idyllic portrayal of the homes and gardens of the British landed classes. The complacencies inherent in the stock phrase are ironized by the poem's almost elucidatory sensitivity to the kind of busyness of its everyday rural scene. Blah-de, blah-de, blah. Right, next one. Sea serpent, that is that makes extensive use of the Norse myth of Thor's two attempts to catch the Midgard serpent, the Midgard snake, the world serpent. This is something that comes through again and again in MacDiarmid, like in the story Andy. It's all over the place. Heather O'Donoghue's book, Heather O'Donoghue of Oxford, has written a book on Norse influence in English literature, and she's got quite a lot about MacDiarmid's use of Norse myth. Right, the poem Good Conceit is a response to the English Tory W.H. Crossland, his famous anti-Scottish lyric of 1899, The Good Conceit. Morning, among other things, reimagines the Greek legend of Eos and Ares by putting it in a Borders farm setting. Right, the Three Fishes is like MacDiarmid takes stuff from Jethro Bithell, he takes stuff from Babette Deutsch and Yarmolinsky, and he acknowledges his sources, but he also takes stuff where he doesn't acknowledge the sources, surprise, surprise. And there are two poems among the early lyrics that come from Lucy M.J. Garnett's Greek folk poesy. The interesting thing about the Three Fishes, MacDiarmid makes quite a different poem on the, from the Garnett translation. But the interesting thing is that Yeats uses exactly the same translation as the basis of his The Song of Wandering Aengus, 1897, and neither Yeats nor MacDiarmid acknowledged their source in Garnett. So MacDiarmid wasn't the only bastard poet stealing stuff at this time. Bombinations of a Chimera is a self-deprecating title because it's taken from the name of a fictitious learned tract in the catalogue of St. Victor's Library in Gantua and Pantagruel, which should have been italics. Sorry about that, folks. And the Latin means the most subtle question, whether a chimera bombinating in a vacuum can consume second intentions, as was debated for 10 weeks at the Council of Constance. And it's interesting that this is one of MacDiarmid's more quote unquote metaphysical poems, but the title makes fun of its own arguably over scholastic procedures. Right, next one, if we may. The interest in language is an interest basically in the English language. I think it's possible to misunderstand MacDiarmid's attitude to Scots, partly because he wanted us to misunderstand it. He wrote an awful lot of stuff about, rather essentialist stuff about Scottish psychology and its relation to the Scots language and so forth. But really, in practical terms, MacDiarmid saw Scots as what it is, a variety of English, a very special variety of English in many ways, but it is, in the broader scheme of things, I think it has to be said, an English dialect. And he's very interested in the English language in Sancho and Penipeep. In the Hedgeback is a poem about orgasm that's basically an exploration of the locution, the earth moved. Just underneath us to ken that a while used to be. In the Pantry, Nuch land on an upward sea in a wind like a blue doubt, mock and flee. That's about someone who's lost his appetite for life, as the cliche puts it. Hungry waters is taken from the phrase, not exactly an everyday phrase, admittedly, hungry water, which was once employed in chemistry to denote the supposed capacity of distilled water to absorb minerals from vessels and containers to compensate for what had been lost in the process of purification. It is used in geology to acknowledge the power of swiftly flowing water to pick up sediment. And MacDiarmid teases these meanings out by linking it to some of the material in Jameson's entry on Dabernack. Now, Empty Vessel is another poem that's very interested in gender. It takes the proverb, empty vessels make most noise, which is usually employed in a misogynistic context, and it sort of reverses that and makes the empty girl, you know, kind of fills her with feeling, if one can put it that way. Right, that was a very quick tour before we come to the water go. And now this is, I think, this is the kind of the breakthrough that I had after I'd finished editing volume 1. I suddenly realized that the water go is intertextual in a way that I hadn't imagined. If you'll bear with me, I'll read it. A wheat fornicht the outtrammel, I saw yon antren thing. A water go with chitten nicht a yont the onding, and I thought to the last while look ye geed before ye deed. There was nae reek of the Ravrocks house that nicht and nae mine, but I hae thought of that foolish licht ever since sign, and I think that maybe at last I ken what your look meant then. Now, it's clear that the words of this poem are taken from Sir James Wilson. You can see them on the slide there. I don't have to rehearse them. MacDiarmid talks about extending Scots without psychological violence when he writes about the water go. And that's a phrase that, in a sense, recognizes something that a lot of people have felt about the water go, that he breaks through into some sort of, he has access to emotional subtlety in a way that his early poetry in English didn't have. And it has usually been, it's taken for granted in that rather old-fashioned way, perhaps, that this must have had to do something with something personal. And because we know that there was one of the big breaches in Christopher Greaves' life was when he was sent home from the Junior Student Centre in Edinburgh, but took a week to get home. And by the time he got home, his father had died, having read the letter on his deathbed about Christopher being sent home. So people have assumed that it is about the father's death. And they have been encouraged in this assumption by lines from Work in Progress, published in the Modern Scot in July 1931. But I think if these lines prove anything, I mean, these lines make it less rather than more likely that the water go refers to James Greaves' death. Yes, there is a look, but the connection between the two looks is problematic. As in the water go, the look of the dying person in From Work in Progress is evoked in relation to hope, but the hope now pertains not to the afterlife, but merely to the earthly future of the soon-to-be departed sons. And very significantly, the look in the 1931 poem is a last look, but it is not wild. There's nothing wild about it. And that absence of wildness, I think, sunders the connection with the water go. What the water go was about was discovered back in 1982 by the late Ruth McQuillan, a great explorer of the biographical context of MacDiarmid. She found the intertextual key to the water go, but didn't understand what she found because she was looking for keys to MacDiarmid's psyche. And she speculates there that the hymn O Love That Wilt Not Let Me Go was sung at his father's funeral. Now, it is a funeral hymn, and it's sung to this day at Presbyterian and Methodist funerals, but it is it's I think a wonderfully good hymn, by the way, if you're into that sort of thing. But it is a hymn that clearly meant much to MacDiarmid. And there's a poem, one of the it's a great rhetorical commotion, one of the most problematic poems in Annals of the Five Senses, was written in 1921 under the title The Spanish Pro. It appears as Spanish Girl in Annals. It appears to be about a young woman called Marigina, who also crops up again in the Longer Water of Life poem as Yon Eastern Whore, a connection to the Spanish Pro. But in that very self-consciously risque poem, Spanish Girl, in 1921, MacDiarmid, in line 9, writes, "O light that callest me by name," and in line 24, "O rose that will not let me rest." Two strong echoes of this hymn already before the Watergaw. The connection between the Watergaw and the hymn was drawn to Ruth McQuillan's attention by a retired gentleman in a tutorial. But I would like to look at, in particular, two details. "O light that followest all my way, I yield my flickering torch to thee." This is a Chitternicht. And in the next slide, "I trace the rainbow through the rain and feel the promise is not vain that morn shall cheerless be." The Watergaw, speaker of the Watergaw, sees the rainbow. I saw the Antrim thing, which is stronger than trace, but nonetheless, it's chittering, the idea of having to trace it through the rain. The rain is the onding. I think you can see the connection between the two poems there. And the last while look is the dying person's mixture of consternation and hope. You know, his hope that the promise is not vain, his wish, his fear that it may be. Now, we saw in the case of the Eames stain that secondary material, contingent material, if you like, seems to go into, you know, Robert Chambers's discussion of the background to the empty vessel story, the Jenny Nettle story, seems to go into the poem. I think the lines, "There was nae reek in the Leibrock's house that nicht, and nene mine," may have a connection to the life of George Matheson. Matheson was immensely famous. He was immensely famous among Christians, Protestants across the globe, particularly in the Empire, but most particularly in his native Scotland. And he considered himself that this hymn was his greatest work. And he says, "My hymn was composed at the Manstead in Ellen on the evening of the 6th of June, 1882. I was at that time alone. It was the day of my sister's marriage, and the rest of the family were staying overnight in Glasgow. Something had happened to me which was known only to myself, and which caused me the most severe mental suffering. The hymn was the fruit of that suffering. It was the quickest bit of work I ever did in my life. I had the impression rather of having it dictated to me by some inward voice than of working it out myself. I am quite sure that the whole work was completed in 5 minutes, and equally sure that it never received at my hands any retouching or correction. The Hymnal Committee of the Church of Scotland desired the change of one word." Now, I was going to finish, but I failed to embed. There are many, a recording of it. There are many, many recordings of the hymn on YouTube. So I'll leave you explore those in your own at your leisure. Can I say I'm not declaring that the Watergall is in some way a commentary on "O Love That Wilt Not Let Me Go." I'm simply inviting you to consider the evidence for a connection between them. And hoping thereby to widen the discussion of the non-dictionary sources of Sangshaw and Pennypeep. Thank you very much. Okay.
Yeah, that's great, Patrick. Thank you.
Right.
Thank you
Okay.
Are you good? Is Zoom now kind of bringing the focus back to me? Can someone kind of nod if that's happening, or are we still looking at Patrick? I may need to.
No, what I can see again.
Okay, great. Thank you, Patrick. That was a really interesting insight into some of the sources that MacDiarmid was using there in the earlier work. Yeah, thanks very much. Next up we have Dr. Scott Lyle. Scott is Associate Professor of Modern and Scottish Literature at Edinburgh Napier University. His main research interests are in the areas of modernism and 20th century literature, especially in Scotland, and much of his work concerns the interwar revival in Scottish literature, known as the Scottish Literary Renaissance, in which he has published widely and been interviewed on TV and radio. His first book, Hugh MacDiarmid's Poetry and Politics of Place, was published by Edinburgh University Press, and he is co-editor of the Edinburgh Companion to Hugh MacDiarmid and editor of the International Companion to Lewis Grassic Gibbon and Community in Modern Scottish Literature. He is project leader of the RSE-funded Scottish Revival Network and co-editor with Dr. Rona Brown of Scottish Literary Review. Scott's paper is titled To Meddle with the Thistle, the Scottish Chapbook, Modernism and Renaissance.
Thanks, Jim. I'll just share these slides with you. Yeah, okay, so I'm going to talk about the Scottish chapbook where MacDiarmid first appeared. So Hugh MacDiarmid, he had not yet adopted MacDiarmid with the full Mac, first appeared in the first number of the Scottish chapbook as the author of Nisbet and Interlude in post-war Glasgow. The story or sketch appeared across 2 editions of the chapbook in August and September 1922. MacDiarmid's first publication is self-consciously modern in style and subject. Nisbet speaks to the variousness of personality pointed to in C.M. Greaves' editorial causerie in the first edition, which quotes Leo Shestov to the effect that people should not remain constant in their convictions. Now, Alan will go into much greater depth on Nisbet later in this session, but the sketch delights formally and thematically in fracture and alienation, the material and psychological conditions of post-war city life that were exploited in many modernist representations. Odd though it might seem in retrospect that MacDiarmid's first publication was in English prose rather than Scots poetry, but Nisbet sets out his stall in the chapbook as a new voice in modernism as well as in Scottish literature. So I want in this paper to look more closely at the Scottish chapbook, Greaves' aims for the journal, and the extent to which those were fulfilled. I will consider it not only against his own objectives for the journal and for the Scottish Renaissance, but alongside definitions of the modernist little magazine more generally. The Scottish chapbook was published monthly, starting in August 1922. Alan Bowell gives the date of the first edition as the 26th of August 1922. There were 15 editions in total, 12 in volume 1 and 3 in volume 2. The journal's final edition, volume 2, number 3, came in November-December 1923. And this number, like the previous edition in September-October 1923, was a double edition. The chapbook had 2 covers. The better known Red Lion was the cover for every edition up to and including number 11 of volume 1. And you can see on your screen also there the back cover of the first edition, which has been pointed out, ironically, has a picture of Harry Lauder selling fountain pens. With the next edition, and the final number of volume 1, number 12, the cover changed to an illustration by Pittendray McGilvray with lettering by Miss Campbell Muirhead. The new bluey-green cover editions would also include occasional illustrations, entirely lacking from the starker red cover editions, and the manifesto declaration, not tradition's precedents, which appeared on the red cover, disappeared from the new cover. The journal was priced throughout its short lifetime at 1 and 6 per individual copy and 15 shillings for an annual subscription. This is probably on the cheaper side in comparison to many magazines in the 1920s. According to Peter Brooker and Andrew Thacker, 2 shillings and 6pence seems to become a fairly standard price for both quarterlies and monthlies. However, this drops in the 1930s to 1 shilling and 6pence, reflecting both economic factors at play in the period and, in the case of left-leaning magazines, a commitment to making the publication more widely available. Brooker and Thacker point out that the mostly quarterly The Criterion, edited of course by T.S. Eliot, and also launched in 1922, was priced expensively at 3 shillings and 6pence in order, in their words, to appeal to a selective readership. Greaves' editorial stance with the chapbook also aimed for discerning readers. Writing to the Glasgow Herald on the 11th of May 1922, seeking subscribers for his new monthly magazine, he made clear that the venture is not to be a commercial one. It is intended to cover expenses and no more. He made a similar point in a letter to Helen Cruikshank the following week. As opposed to Northern Numbers, which, quote, had to sell, so I was to a certain extent out for names and included certain types of verse greatly admired by many people, to which I personally am utterly indifferent. However, in the chapbook, commercial conditions won't weigh. I'll be out for genuinely significant and experimental work wherever it is to be found. Whereas the Criterion was published by Faber and Guire, before Faber and Faber, with initial financial support from Lady Rothermere, Greaves' chapbook was self-published, printed at the Review Press, where he worked as a journalist in Montrose, and distributed from his council house at 16 Links Avenue in Youngstown. While, as Brooker and Thacker argue, economic and symbolic or cultural capital coincide with Eliot's Criterion, the conditions of production and dissemination of the chapbook, along with its geographical and social provenance, i.e. that it was produced in a small Scottish town by a working journalist, mean that it lacked the same kinds of cultural and canonical clout as Eliot's magazine, certainly in broader modernist terms beyond Scottish literature, and the restricted finances of Greaves' operation would limit from the start. Indeed, as you can see in the examples here, the journal is pitted with advertisements asking for subscribers to enable it to continue. Greaves' experiences running the chapbook are doubtless more characteristic of the typical economic model of the little magazine than that of the more prestigious and relatively long-running Criterion. While admitting that, quote, diverse in size, agenda, and longevity, modernist little magazines are, like modernism itself, vexingly difficult to define, Suzanne Churchill and Adam McKibble propose that little magazines are non-commercial enterprises founded by individuals or small groups intent upon publishing the experimental works or radical opinions of untried, unpopular, or underrepresented writers, stating further that whatever the format, scope, or preferred topics of conversation, little magazines tend to share two features: a vexed relationship to a larger mainstream public and an equally vexed relationship to money. For Churchill and McKibble, this means that those who wrote for, edited, and published little magazines often walked a tightrope between rejecting and reforming mass audiences. There remains the critical perception of modernism as pursuing aestheticism and the autonomy of art as distinct from the public realm, indeed in reaction to the pollution of that realm through commercial standards. This is true in part, and MacDiarmid made noises to this effect throughout his career. However, as Mark S. Morrison argues, most British and American modernists of this period, and his focus is on 1905 to 1920, did not pursue the radical attacks on aesthetic autonomy and aura that characterized the Dada and Surrealist practices. Rather, they lamented art's loss of its public socio-cultural function and wished to forge a more significant public function for it. In other words, they still saw their work as something distinctly aesthetic, but challenged aesthetic autonomy's tendency to isolate this experience and strip it of social significance. And Morrison there mentions Dada and Surrealism as examples of a radically disruptive aesthetic, and Grieve, somewhat oddly perhaps, mentions Dada in the first chapbook editorial, where he laments what he perceives as the lack of new periodicals and publishing houses in Scotland. And this is a quote from him. "None of those significant little periodicals, crude, absurd, enthusiastic, vital, have yet appeared in Achtermachty or Ardnamurchan. It is discouraging to reflect that this is not the way the Dadaists go about the business." However, Morrison's overall point broadly characterises Grieve's project with the chapbook, which seeks to raise the aesthetic standards of Scottish literature, not for its own sake, I would argue, but rather to reorient and revive what Grieve sees as a demeaned literary culture. In these terms, this is not an elite merely talking to itself, but a proposed reformation of a national literature through the practices of a vanguard, a kind of trickle-down culture, if you like. Grieve's aims for the chapbook are outlined in the chapbook programme, which appeared in the journal's opening pages, as well as in his editorial causeries. The French title of Grieve's editorial may indicate the intended European direction of Renaissance away from the assumed parochiality of current Scottish literature, often complained about in the editorials, while the title of the chapbook itself points to the DIY quality of the magazine, although the more populist traditions of the chapbook form sit somewhat awkwardly against the magazine's elitist aims. Taken together, the chapbook programme and causerie indicate the manifesto of the magazine. For Ezra Pound, writing in a letter of 1950 to Robert Creeley, little magazines should come with a declaration of policy. Pound made a similar point in his important 1930 essay, Small Magazines. This is a quote from Pound. "It is, curiously enough, not so important that an editorial policy should be right, as that it should succeed in expressing and giving clear definition to a policy or set of ideas." As Brooker and Thacker point out, there are, quote, "close ties between the defiance of the manifesto form and the vehicle for that defiance, the magazine, and these were both crucial to the development of modernism." However, one question around Grieve's chapbook programme is the extent to which the other contributors were or were not in agreement with it, and where that leaves the notion of a Scottish Renaissance or even a Scottish modernism, as these are essentially what the programme proposes or wishes to encourage. Jessie Annie Anderson, for instance, was a fairly regular poetic contributor to the chapbook, and her work is the focus of modern Scottish bibliographies in Volume 1, Number 6. And this was a regular feature spotlighting the work of lesser-known figures considered to be contributing to a Scottish Renaissance. Grieve praises what he regards as the authenticity of her work and character, writing, "Miss Anderson has learned no parlour tricks. Coteries cannot capture her, nor stunts corrupt. She has never exploited herself, nor does her work lend itself to exploitation by others." Yet, as Charlotte Lauder has pointed out, Anderson was critical of the Renaissance and the chapbook programme specifically, writing to McGilvray that anything like a genuine and independent love for the arts and literature is the backbone of the chapbook movement, I cannot see. there is a strongly collectionist suggestion about the whole output. The use of the phrase collectionist alludes to Anderson's speculation that the chapbook was Labour funded, but it is inappropriate in other ways. Grieve proposes a renaissance of Scottish literature in the pages of the chapbook, in the editorial theory of Scots letters from volume 1, number 7, for example. But at manifesto level, this is decidedly a one-man show, not a community of interests. There was an editorial causerie in every edition of the chapbook up to and including volume 1, number 11 in June 1923, and then they stopped. Cairns-Craig speculates that the editorial stopped when at this time, the weekly Scottish Nation began to absorb Grieve's propagandistic energy. In other words, Grieve, who was working on multiple different projects at this point, including the journal The Scottish Nation, had nothing left over to put into the chapbook editorials. This is doubtless true. However, the causeries had been somewhat uneven in quality from the start. They include important material, such as a theory of Scots letters, which ran across 3 numbers from February to April 1923, and which promoted the idea of a literature in Scots commensurate with European modernist developments. MacDiarmid's various Scots poems in the chapbook, most notably the Watergaw and the Eamostane, substantiate the theory in practice. Many editorials attacked, often comically, the current state of Scottish literature and what Grieve regarded as the timidity of the national cultural life. This example is from the first causerie. Scottish literature, like other literatures, has been written almost exclusively by blasphemers, immoralists, dipsomaniacs, and madmen, but unlike most literatures, has been written about almost exclusively by ministers. Several of the causeries, such as the one in the Burns special edition of January 1923, that's volume 1, number 6, were influenced by G. Gregory Smith's Scottish literature character and influence, and indicate the extent to which Grieve directed his own estimations of Scottish literary culture and history through the lens of personality. Other causeries, though, were more or less squibs. The characteristic series of quotations run together to no particular overall effect. What I'm getting at here is that Grieve was somewhat out of breath before June 1923 when the editorials ended, and while some have remained important in explaining the theory behind the poetic practice, quite a few are negligible space fillers. Beyond the manifesto-driven editorials, the creative highlights of the chapbook are MacDiarmid's various poetic contributions, many of which are genuinely groundbreaking, and the still underestimated poetry of Grieve, whose English language metaphysical poetry, and I'm thinking here of the likes of A Moment in Eternity and Science in Poetry, remains in the shadow of MacDiarmid's Scots dictionary-based experimentalism. Some other fine work was published in the Scottish chapbook, various ballads by Edwin Muir, poems by Marian Angus, Violet Jacob, William Souter, Neil Gunn, Pittenry McGilvray, Jessie Annie Anderson, and Christine Orr. But that sits alongside work by less well-remembered names such as Dudley Beardmore, A. Clark Kennedy, W. M. Parker, Susan Miles, E. Isabel Cumming, J. A. Finlayson, R. J. McLeish, and David Horn, some of which is less impressive, and much of which has a distinctly pre-modernist feel to it. As Craig comments, the reinvigoration of Scots might have been central to the agenda of the newly born MacDiarmid, but a large proportion of the work Grieve published fell into traditional Scottish categories, and actually, much of the poetry is in a formally conventional English. Grieve criticised the late 19th century Gadesian revival in his first editorial, contending that the Scottish literary revival proved to be a promise that could not be kept. There is something of the fin de siècle about many of the contributions in the chapbook. Beardmore's decadent-inspired poetry is a case in point, and the bookplate on the left of the screen is the bookplate for Beardmore's poems, which was designed by James Guthrie. And McGilvray's bluey green cover has an air of sub-John Duncan symbolism about it. Grieve may have wanted the Scottish Renaissance to set a modern agenda for the 20th century very different from his withering assessment of the Celtic Revival, but the contributions of many of the other poets and artists to the chapbook inadvertently link the journal and the Renaissance back to the late 19th century. Of Nisbet, where this paper and MacDiarmid started, Bold writes, Grieve's alter ego made his debut as a writer of English dialogue, not Scots verse. He was probably initially created to swell the chorus of contributors to the Scottish chapbook, to add one more modernistic voice to the journal's progressive theme, and other pseudonyms would include A.K. Laidlaw and the reviewer Martin Gillespie. The use of nom de plumes to assist in literary and cultural national revival is familiar in other small nations, such as Portugal, where Fernando Pessoa constructed various heteronyms, and in Ireland, where W.B. Yeats communed with astral spirits who provided him with metaphors for poetry. While in each case, there is a creative and psychological rationale for these inventions, there is also the more mundane one of swelling the revivalist ranks, particularly for Pessoa and Grieve. Yet Bold's claim that Grieve created MacDiarmid to add one more modernistic voice to the journal's progressive theme may be underestimating the extent to which Grieve's various contributions, as also MacDiarmid, were the main or only modernist ones in the chapbook. The invention by Grieve of MacDiarmid may not signify the birth of modernism in Scotland, but its stillbirth, the absence of a distinctly modernist Scottish Renaissance. But the chapbook, whatever Grieve's propaganda may insist upon, indicates that the Scottish literary revival has a longer trajectory, linking the Renaissance back to the modes of the late 19th century. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Scott. That was a really interesting set of insights into how all of that was playing out in the 20s. Some couple of questions for you, but I'll leave them till later. Our third panelist this morning is Professor Michael Whitworth. Michael's publications include Einstein's Wake, Relativity, Metaphor and Modernist Literature, and Virginia Woolf. He has published several articles and chapters on MacDiarmid, most recently in 2020 in Poetry and the Dictionary, edited by Andrew Blades and Piers Pennington. He is Professor of Modern Literature and Culture in the English Faculty, University of Oxford, and Tutorial Fellow at Merton College. Michael.
Thank you. Right, I'll just try to get this slide going. No, that's good. Sorry, I'll need to share my screen first, won't I? And then sorry. Okay, having system preferences problem.
Are you using a Mac?
Yes, yes. Is that
it's if you are Alan, would you be able to go third, and then Michael, if you...
Yeah, to be honest, I think I can just do. I'll just do it as a talking head. They're not crucial, and I think the poems are familiar to everyone here. So I think we'll go ahead that way. Yeah. Okay. So. Yeah, okay, so MacDiarmid, the spaceman. Hugh MacDiarmid in 1922 might seem to have had his gaze set steadily on his country and the future of its literature, but in this paper I'd like to suggest that if he had one eye on Scotland, he had another on the stars. The moon, the stars, the planets, the licht and the lift appear frequently in Sangshaw and Pennywheat. My basic question concerns how the references to extraterrestrial space and to the planets signify, how we should best read them. In particular, given that space and space-time had been widely discussed in the early 1920s in the context of Einstein's special and general theories of relativity, how far should that knowledge form part of our interpretations? If we were to set aside then recent science How far are MacDiarmid's extraterrestrial references drawing on older and other traditions? A romantic association of space with the spiritual and the sublime, for example. In relation to these questions, it may be valuable to make comparison with Thomas Hardy. Hardy deeply admired the romantic tradition, but had also absorbed a mechanistic and deterministic materialism from Victorian science. The tensions within both poets' works and their willingness to play one set of expectations against the other make for an interesting comparison. As well as making a comparison with Hardy, it may be useful to consider or to reconsider the question of the extent and the nature of MacDiarmid's interest in his work, and particularly his poetry. So a clear indication of what might be at stake comes in the second stanza of Empty Vessel in Penny Week. Ones with worlds to swing, dinner sings is sweet, the licht that bends o'er a thing is less ta'en up we eat. That collocation of licht and bends had, in its English form, become well known in 1919 and the years immediately following. In November 1919, the Astronomer Royal, Arthur Eddington, had announced the experimental proof of Einstein's general theory of relativity, in which space-time warps around massive objects, and in which, in consequence, light bends as it travels. I won't give a full account here of the various newspaper headlines and non-technical accounts of general relativity that used phrases such as light caught bending. That was probably the one slide that mattered, which is the Daily Mail, unfortunately, used that phrase. But others kind of emphasized that idea of bending, and it turns up in the accounts of them in many weeklies and monthlies that MacDiarmid may have been familiar with. There isn't also possible time to kind of sift through the evidence about the possible places where MacDiarmid might have read about contemporary science in the early 1920s, but there are many. The poem's collocation of licht and bends might derive from scientific discourse, but it does so in a subtle and ambiguous way. Unlike, for example, the geoselenic gimbal or other terms in MacDiarmid's synthetic English poems, it doesn't immediately conspicuously announce its scientific status. One might also say, unlike the patient etherized on a table at the opening of T.S. Eliot's well-known poem, it's not jutting out as a piece of vocabulary. Light and bending are not exclusively scientific terminology, even if that collocation of them had strongly scientific resonances. So while Louisa Gairn, discussing Empty Vessel, is quite right to refer to the licht as interstellar, we need to tread carefully. A reader innocent of Einstein might think of the bending light as the curve of a rainbow, for example. Empty Vessel shares with the watergore the feeling of loss and of a half-articulated feeling existing beyond what is immediately perceived. It might also not be immediately obvious why the question of light bending matters in Empty Vessel. Are readers missing anything from the meaning of the poem if they don't know about light bending in the Einsteinian sense? It is true that most of the poem's emotional power comes from the first stanza and its presentation of a seemingly timeless scene of loss and grieving. One might think that nothing could be more removed than this scene from the modern world of physical theories and scientific discoveries. The implied scene of a desolate landscape in which the cairn is the only reference point could belong to any period, even if there are historical forces behind that kind of landscape. The new science is relevant, though, because it allows MacDiarmid to find consolation and to insinuate that the universe might not be entirely indifferent to loss. If the eternal silence of infinite spaces is as terrifying to poets as it had been to Blaise Pascal, then Einstein's universe, finite but unbounded, seems like it might wrap itself around the grieving woman and provide some kind of comfort. Granted, the curvature of the universe doesn't imply any sort of care, and granted, even if we allow ourselves to believe that it does, the larger import of the comparison is that the woman is more taken up with her loss than is the bending light. But for a moment, it seems as if that universe might offer something more comforting, more caring. Was that a new development in Penny Wheat? Sangshaw covers a range of possibilities for the ways that outer space might be used in poetry. The understanding of space in the Bonnie Brookett Bairn is astrological. Venus, Mars, the moon, and the earth are all personified. In the second of the Au clair de la lune poems, Moonstruck, the moon is again personified, but in terms that are less conventional. In the third poem in that sequence, the frame of reference is closer to a materialist one, in which the earth is reduced to a bare old stone. The materiality of the earth is the key point in the Hedgeback. MacDiarmid extends the idea of the wild black nith beyond its ballad origins and makes it into a scene of epistemological uncertainty. Within that scene, the earth underfoot provides the last connection to sensory knowledge of the world. In the Emis Stan, the materiality of the world in space is again foregrounded. The world, like an Emis stain, wags in the lift. MacDiarmid seems to be testing the validity of different ways of understanding space, the stars, and the planets. Each becomes a contested sign, caught between various forms of materialist and spiritual understanding. The materialist accounts emphasize the smallness of the earth and its insignificance. The innumerable Christ stages the contestation of the spiritual and the materialist very clearly. While the central idea of multiple worlds is taken from J.Y. Simpson's 1922 theological book, Man and the Attainment of Immortality, other elements touch on ideas familiar in expositions of relativity. Simpson's book itself makes only passing reference to Einstein as a representative, along with Freud, as a period of intellectual challenge that was inevitably going to lead to new ways of thinking theologically. So, in other words, that's not a source for MacDiarmid. Firstly, in the poem, there's the thought experiment of what our world would look like if viewed from a distant planet. That idea is not unique to nor essential to relativity, but it's a common element in expositions. And the more kind of earthbound version of that being thinking about one train passing another, which turns up all the time. Second, the idea of light traveling through space. In the first two lines of the second stanza, MacDiarmid considers places beyond the stars or e'en can see, and places that are further than their lichts can fly. The poem ends with a third idea that owes more to 19th century physics of thermodynamics than to more recent developments, the idea of heat death and of the earth becoming cold as the moon. However, alongside these materialist ideas is the idea of the star that led the wise men to Bethlehem. The uniqueness of Christ's birth is displaced and questioned by the materialist idea of there being innumerable worlds. And there's I haven't had time to kind of, only recently came across it, but Colin Kidd has written about extraterrestrials and the heavens in the history of Scottish theology a few years ago. And I think that's something I'm going to need to look into in further detail. The idea of the insignificant materiality of the earth is by no means unique to the poems of Sangshaw. In Science and Poetry, which we've already just seen in Scott's slides, the earth is reduced to one green gleaming point of light, while in Gilda Mori, the speaker sees the world as the gods may, like a grey boulder. And it's at this point it's interesting, I think, to introduce Thomas Hardy as a point of comparison. Not only are there many similarities or points of similarity between the poets, but points of difference highlight the specificity of what MacDiarmid is doing. Like MacDiarmid, Hardy invokes extraterrestrial space in a variety of ways, seemingly mutually contradictory. At times in his poetry, the planets are substitutes for the classical gods, scowling on human lives, for example. At times they are material things, and as such are the objects of scientific prediction. However, those predictions are subordinated sometimes to a pre-Enlightenment language of portents and of divine inscription, as in the poem A Sign Seeker, and elsewhere to a kind of Hardian notion of fate. In other places, Hardy plays with the tensions between a religious and a materialistic understanding of space. In Drummer Hodge, the strange stars of southern Africa that look over Hodge's grave ought to have a meaning, but do not. If the immediate reason for their meaninglessness is there not being the familiar European constellations, part of the poem's resonance comes from its recognition that materialist skepticism renders all constellations arbitrary and lacking in significance. Like MacDiarmid too, Hardy is conscious of the Earth's position in a constantly rotating solar system. At times, this idea comes into the poems quite casually. Hardy's poem A Spot from around 1900, it describes the sun and the shadows wheeling. And elsewhere in the poem, which I urge you to look at, A Cathedral Facade at Midnight, the idea of the moon moving across the statues on the cathedral facade is central to the poem's conceit. The extent of MacDiarmid's familiarity with Hardy's poetry is difficult to gauge. And indeed, the extent of his familiarity with other works. Patrick has just reminded us of Under the Greenwood Tree as being a novel that he's apparently familiar with. In 1922, MacDiarmid quotes Arnold Bennett listing Tessa the d'Urbervilles and Jude the Obscure as two examples of novels that have been banned in Scottish libraries. But in a sense, that's simply MacDiarmid drawing in Bennett for other reasons. In the following year, he quotes for the first time from the preface to The Return of the Native, Hardy's definition of literature as the written expression of revolt against accepted things. And that's a phrase that he quotes and slightly misquotes for the rest of his career. It becomes amplified to become against all accepted things certainly by Lucky Poet. And you find the Radio Times quoting that in 1977 for their notice for a Kaleidoscope, I think, program about MacDiarmid in that year. In 1924, MacDiarmid also mentions Hardy in passing as the proponent of a pessimistic philosophy. At some point, although I've not been able to find out when, he acquires a copy of Vere Henry Collins's Talks with Thomas Hardy at Mac's Gate, published in 1928, but very shortly after Hardy's death. It's mostly discussions about the sort of business of publishing. It's not a terribly interesting book, it must be said. From 1933 onwards, MacDiarmid begins to cite Hardy as a poet interested in verbal innovation, verbal experimentation, and the use of recondite words. And in doing so, MacDiarmid is to some extent establishing an antecedent for his own synthetic Scots, but more importantly, I think, at that point is finding an antecedent for the use of synthetic English in Stony Limits and other poems. In highlighting that aspect of Hardy's poetry, MacDiarmid is undeniably led by Ivor Evans, whose English poetry in the late 19th century, or later 19th century, from 1933, he frequently quotes in that context. And when he's not quoting it, he seems to be paraphrasing its broad argument. That MacDiarmid doesn't discuss Hardy's vocabulary before the appearance of Evans's book might suggest that he took little interest in it in the 1920s. So I think especially in the light of Dennis Taylor's huge, magnificent book on Thomas Hardy and English philology, it's really interesting to align Hardy and MacDiarmid as users of discrete lexical items and of people who in a sense will break rules about the appropriateness of particular items in order to achieve an effect. I mean, I think the great merit of Taylor's book is it seems to turn on its head the objection that Hardy's use of diction is clumsy and makes it into a kind of quite radical and fascinating procedure. While that kind of work on Hardy might seem to align him with MacDiarmid, we can't actually be sure that this was anything other than an accident, or if you like, an emanation of a larger result of late Victorian philology and the availability of these various dictionaries and word books and so forth. So there isn't conclusive evidence. And from that point of view, I think Hardy's oeuvre is as valuable as a point of contrast and comparison as it is as the basis for a kind of causal argument. What such a comparison does bring out is not just that both poets are working out the consequences of atheistic materialism, as Catherine Maynard has discussed, but that both are fascinated by the image of the Earth and of other planets rotating in space. Both are fascinated with the question of whether any special significance can be given to a small pebble floating in space. But MacDiarmid is more conspicuously interested in the movement of light across the space and in the idea of such light as conveying information. That idea didn't originate with special or general relativity theory, but it acquired a new prominence in the years following 1919. And indeed, there's a lot more I'd like to say if I at some point produce a longer version of this paper about A Drunk Man Looks at the Thistle, because by the time of that poem, some of the ideas that are tentatively or ambiguously present in the early lyric poems become more explicit and more fully employed. I'm thinking of passages such as the description of the earth as a tree that spreads rammel of licht that heine end. And in the same passage, man's little point of view being set against the wider cosmos. I'm thinking of the later passage in The Drunk Man, where Scotland is squatting like a flea on the Berlin edge of a great wheel, and in which historically significant battles, Flodden, Bannockburn, become minute points in a larger space-time. And that's drawing upon a particular expository idea that derives from Flammarion onwards. There's also a whole question about MacDiarmid's claim to have been in correspondence with Flammarion in about 1911 for the New Astrology article. But again, if there is evidence there, it's in a it's in the archives somewhere on the outskirts of Paris, which I need to explore further. And it may be an entirely wasted journey, is my fear, to have a look at a microfilm of whatever they've received. So yeah, I think some of the material that we're seeing in 1925, 26, and indeed back into the slightly earlier poems comes out more explicitly and on a larger scale in A Drunk Man. And what's I'm suggesting then is that those ideas were nascent and become more explicit, and that A Drunk Man also brings out something that's implicit in those volumes. If we think about that phrase about Scotland squatting like a flea on the Berlin edge of a great wheel, MacDiarmid is setting national concerns and the even more local concerns of specific dialects against a cosmic backdrop. That's an intriguingly ambivalent gesture, it seems to me. It suggests that Scotland and Scots have a rightful place in an immense universe, but it also reminds us that they're tiny and no more significant than any other nation or any other language. Thank you.
Thanks, Michael. That was really interesting. I was struck by the idea of the kind of continuities that are suggested there between the scientific language that you can see emerging within the Scots, which emerges more in Drunk Man, and then obviously it kind of really takes over in the 30s. Maybe we can have a chat about that later. But no, thank you. That was great. Yeah, on to our final panelist this morning. It's Professor Alan Rheac. Alan is a poet and professor of Scottish literature at the University of Glasgow. Born in Airdrie, Lanarkshire, he studied at Cambridge and Glasgow, worked at the University of Waikato, New Zealand, between 1986 and 2000, and has been back in Scotland since 2001. His books include Poetry, The Winter Book, Homecoming and Wild Blue, Criticism, Hugh MacDiarmid's epic poetry, representing Scotland, and co-authored with Alexander Moffat, Arts of Resistance, Poets, Portraits and Landscapes of Modern Scotland, which was described in the Times Literary Supplement as a landmark book, and Arts of Independence, the Cultural Argument and Why It Matters Most. Rheac and Moffat are also the co-editors of the annotated edition of J.D. Ferguson's radical manifesto book, Modern Scottish Painting. Alan is also contributor to numerous books and journals and co-editor of the Edinburgh Companion to 20th Century Scottish Literature and Scotland's Poets and the Nation, as well as being general editor of the complete works of Hugh MacDiarmid. Described as magisterial in the Times, his 734-page Scottish Literature and Introduction was published in 2022. Alan.
Thanks very much. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
And I'm going to share my screen in a moment. But I just want to say thanks, first of all, to Jim and to Scott for setting this up. It's already been terrific and fascinating, and we'll come back to all the discussions that are prompted. I want to concentrate on Nisbet, the piece that's been mentioned before from the first 2 issues of the Scottish Chapbook. I've described it maybe provocatively as a short dramatic trialogue for 3 characters: Duthie, the man who asks questions; Nisbet, back from the dead, killed in 1915, although this isn't literally mentioned in the piece; and Young, an asinine pontificator. Their encounter engenders an opening of inquiries. Revolutions in Ireland and Russia, sexual repression and proto-feminism, diversity and uniformity, body and soul and what belongs to Caesar, nothing, and leaving home behind. So I want to read this thing, and I want to have the text in front of me as I do, because it's so, at first, perhaps difficult or resistant to a deeper reading, and therefore to be selective about how one might read it and highlight these aspects of it. I think it would be useful just to have the text in front of us. But before I do that, I want to mention the fact, and I'm indebted here to Graham Eddy, the archives of the Edinburgh University Library, for his note. The dramatic trialogue as such might be imagined as a short story or a play, to be enacted. In either case, the presence of voices in conversation is paramount, and a sense of disembodiment creates a spooky, atmospheric ghostliness, obliquely confirmed in unemphatic asides. Now, if the technology is with me, I'll share this first of all. And this is the logo of an operation called Project Theatre, which actually put on Nisbet as a production in Glasgow in 1932. And the director, Frederick Grant, who directed this on the 23rd of December 1932, described the set as a backcloth in symbolic design depicting piles of tenements and everything that is loathsome of Glasgow. Commenting in a letter that he didn't think, in a letter to MacDiarmid or to Grieve, that he did not think that Grieve or MacDiarmid could have ever intended it to be performed, but that in fact some of the passages came out very well indeed. But as you may agree, there was a lack of theatre. Nevertheless, the experiment was interesting. Now, if I can move that to this, what you should see is the review, which appeared in the Daily Record on the 24th of December 1932. And it kind of confirms Grant's opinion. There's little in the way of dramatic theatricality, but the language, engagement, and bagatelle of ideas is constant. And within the theatre of ghostly presence, its impact might be strong and curious. So much is noted in the review, where it's described as, quote, a cerebral puzzler that came rather fast for most of the audience and was practically devoid of action, although it presented a pretty problem in adjustment. You can just see that, I think, there at the end of that first paragraph. This strikes me as a really important word for this piece of writing. Adjustment, in fact, could be the conundrum at the heart of the piece. And the autobiographical convictions expressed by MacDiarmid, or rather, at this stage still, Christopher Murray Grieve, enlisted in the Royal Army Medical Corps in July 1915, spending a year in England before being posted as a sergeant to the 42nd General Hospital in Greece. He published some of his earliest poems in the local newspaper in the Eskdale and Lidsdale Advertiser at the town he came from. And the early poems are in tune with those expressing familiar tones of sympathy, encouragement, while the poet remains longing to fight, honouring the fallen. And it's important to consider this context of his enlisting immediately after Nisbet. We'll come back to Nisbet himself in a moment. Immediately following Nisbet and going to the First World War with such things in mind. So in a wee early poem to Private John Roddick, the Australian Expeditionary Force wounded at the Dardanelles, he writes, I wondered if far off beneath the Southern Cross, your heart was torn as mine beneath our Scottish sky, watching the way my schoolmates played their part, while I, all powerlessly, stood by. But by 1915, June 1915, the tone in these early poems is very different. June's golden heart is torn in twain. Her glad blue eyes are grey with tears. Her radiant face is white with pain for the lost promise of the years and the Christ crucified again. So if that's June 1915, note that in April that year, Grieve's best friend from before the war, John Bogue Nisbet, had been killed in the trenches of the Western Front at the age of 23. Grieve was invalided home in 1918 with cerebral malaria, and 7 years later, in the first issue of his magazine, The Scottish Chapbook, as Scott pointed out, under the name of Hugh MacDiarmid, his first published works were these conversation pieces, or piece, in 2 parts, Nisbet, an interlude in post-war Glasgow. The dead soldier, former school friend, gassed to death in France, returned and is thinking about poetry and sound in the industrial Scottish city, and what might make a new insubmersible sort of song. It's characteristic of MacDiarmid to draw that vision of what the future might bring out of the horror and loss of the past. And his description in Annals of the Five Senses that was to appear in 1923 gives us some sense of that retrospective understanding of the world that he was emerging from just prior to his publication of Nisbet. How would he describe the battlefield of the Somme? A broad road leading through an open country, rising and falling in conformity with the configuration of the ground. A long stretch of that road covered with traffic of all kinds. Huge guns being dragged along by heavy tractor engines. Great motor wagons in an interminable line, carrying food, ammunition, clothing. Men marching towards the front, either fresh from their training or returning from rest camps, making once more towards the hell of the trenches. Others returning from the battleground covered with the caking of mud, and yet fretted with an odd cheeriness, despite the strain through which they had passed and the bitter cold that bit to the bone. Long strings of horses. This was the very heart of the trench-crossed, shell-pitted, mine-caverned battle area. As far as the eye could see on each side of the road, there was nothing but desolation. Out of this devastation, a new resolution was rising in MacDiarmid, and he wrote of himself in the Annals. He came back with an idée fixe. Never again must men be made to suffer as in these years of war. As Homi Bhabha puts it in his essay, Interrogating Identity, the state of emergency is always also a state of emergence. So what of this interlude? I'm going to keep the text in front of us as I read on, just to refer to 1 or 2 items in it. I know you won't be able to read it all, and I'm not expecting you to read it all, or for me to read it all, but just to highlight 1 or 2 things as we go through. An interlude. Why interlude? The word itself suggests an in-between moment, precisely located after the war and before whatever happens next. And the last line, as we'll come to it, states baldly that the direction of travel for everyone is the same, further and further away from home. So in this limbo world, we begin at a street corner where direction will change and meetings happen unpredictably. Duffy appears greeting and presumably holding on to Nisbet's hand, as if having just met him, but at the same time gripping him so that he won't be lost. And he's speaking as if to himself. He asks questions of Nisbet and of himself. It's as if Nisbet is part of himself, a finer part, perhaps less given to mundane or even practical matters, asking what breeds likes and dislikes only reinforces his sense of the inexplicability of the world. Meeting people one doesn't know, never will know, is constitutionally incapable of knowing, is extraordinary, he says, but it happens 1,000 times a day. But Duffy has a sense that Nisbet shouldn't be here, and comments that he seems not to be there at all, except physically. For his part, Nisbet recognises in Thea a character who is selective and striking in the peculiar run of his ideas. He urgently wishes to talk and is constantly prodding and pushing, asking questions and making pronouncements to see what response they might prompt in Nisbet. Nisbet admits that he has lived all his life in Glasgow, bar the army. Duthie remarks on Nisbet's apparent lack of personality. That's why you look so disturbingly odd. You're still a mere individual. Nisbet, if this is evocative of a character, a ghost back from the dead, killed in 1915, maintains a mysterious presence, an ambiguous presence in the whole playlet, undisclosed and without reassurance. When Duthie advises him, and it's just around there, making money by writing for the People's Friend and getting 7 and 6 a column for a column of verses is better than having a score of epics in his head. Nisbet responds that he can express himself all right, but what he has to say isn't printable and might not even be intelligible. So are we witnessing an encounter between C.M. Grieve, the working reporter, working journalist, and trying to make some money by his writing, and a ghost of MacDiarmid, who knows that there are books unwritten in his own imagination? It appears to some extent that this is the case. Also, I think the echo there is of Ezra Pound's Mr. Nixon in Hugh Selwyn Moberly from 1920, who advises the aspirant writer to give up poetry, my boy, there's nothing in it. Is Duthie, in some respects, the working reporter, the poet also trying to make a living? Is Nisbet the idealized poet incapable of material presence or commercial priorities or success? And is Young, and he comes along in a moment, the Philistine nemesis of both? When Young enters, Duthie introduces him to Nisbet. This is Nisbet, Young. Aside. It's like saying Jesus, Judas. Nisbet and I were together in France. He was gassed. In a whisper, body and soul. He's not like me. And this leads to the most intense moment so far, when Duthie asks Nisbet if he'd join up if there were another war. And I wonder if I can, you can just see it at the bottom of that page. Would you join up if there were another war? I'd see the king, ... Clatter of a passing motor van makes the remainder of the remark inaudible. Young's take on Duthie is scornful. You're not a human being, you're a mere sorting house. But Nisbet, when pressed, returns to his otherworldly and exemplary symbolic presence. I am constitutionally incapable of rendering any more to Caesar. Nothing is his, and that's all he'll get from me. When Young asks Duthie to describe Nisbet to him, Duthie says he's a poet, but he complains that modern Scottish acoustics are so bad that it isn't worthwhile trying to make himself heard. He's trying to invent a new insubmersible sort of song. Very close, I think, to Paul Valéry's Monsieur Test, who MacDiarmid refers to later on, creating a poetry that cannot be expressed, or dreaming of it. To witness a dogfight that develops into a battle between a drunk Irishman and a pregnant woman, which prompts Nisbet to speculate how is it possible to go home and write verses having seen such things. In Glasgow, Nisbet tells us, sin isn't ever original, it's mechanical. The city, he says, like every other city, is a cannibal that feeds on its own children. And the echo here, it seems to me, is from James Joyce's Stephen Dedalus in The Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man from 1916. Do you know what Ireland is? Ireland is the old sow that eats her farrow. And yet, when asked about politics, Nisbet demurs, I'm not interested in politics. Duthie remonstrates, confirming his own more conventional attitude while emphasizing the political understanding that he believes Nisbet will develop. I'm a mere conventional worm, quite pleased to become another Neil Monroe or wee MacGregor, says Duffy. It's a persona, a projection of MacDiarmid's satirical voice into a character for once, not MacDiarmid. But it's different with you. That's why you look so inappropriate here. The potential Duffy sees in Nisbet becoming politicized is dangerous. But Nisbet seems to acknowledge some truth in it when he says, all forms of literary and artistic expressions, equally with other phenomena of intellectual and spiritual activity, have reached in our Western civilization the point beyond which they can go no further. Western Europe, with America, has exhausted her energies, as Greece, Rome, Assyria, Babylon. Duffy adds anxiously, don't forget Peru. And Young intercedes, sensing that Nisbet is finding his voice, and Nisbet goes on. Exhausted their energies before her, she can add nothing more to the sum of vitally new human knowledge of fresh and adequate channels of self-expression. We must wait. And Duffy muses for the inevitable end, and Nisbet corrects him, or rather the new beginning, which will come from a civilization other than our own. Young now comments this really curious passage at the top of that page right there. Yeah. Young now comments that he thinks renewal is coming, but from Russia. An assurance given to him by an unseen character, doesn't appear in the sketch at all, named Moira, who seems to embody a female national identity analogous to Dark Rosaleen in Ireland, thus bringing into the discussion the idea of a resurgent and emancipated women's movement, a sense of the precedents in self-determination set in Ireland and the socialist revolution, and before that, spiritual revolution symbolized by Dostoevsky. All of these hints and suggestions are supplied by our retrospective reading of what comes after this piece. They're not hugely intrinsically present in the piece, but I don't see how we can avoid them. I think what we're looking at here is a sketch of great interest that still needs to be teased out much further than I've been able to do here. But Nisbet keeps shy of any commitment, saying nothing about Russia or Moira, and rejecting the Irish example, interestingly, in terms similarly reminiscent of Joyce's Stephen Dedalus. My soul is no shillelagh. Deirdre was Mrs. Grundy's maiden name. That is, whatever he might be investing in spiritual identity, it won't be marched to a flag, and even the most independent of Celtic women, Deirdre herself, might transform into the life-denying Puritan of female self-suppression, and that in itself might symbolize Scotland. Young, the asinine pontificator, ends his contributions with a bad pun and self-satisfaction. Duffy bids Nisbet farewell as his companions, and as his companions leave, he comes to the end of his own speculations. Just at the top of that page there. It's easy enough to say that little is worth studying than the development of a soul. But the trouble is to tell just whether it's a soul or not that you're looking at, and then to discover what constitutes development, and so whether there's anything to study or not, looking round dissatisfiedly. How can one be sure of anything in this light? What we know of John Nisbet from Alan Bowles' biography is tantalizingly brief. He was Grieve's closest friend at Broughton, but 1 year his elder, born in 1891 in Berwickshire, and he was a writer of some promise, with what Bowles calls a chilling tale about death and disaster in a fishing village in the Broughton magazine, Seaweed and Sand. The passage Bowles quotes in the biography is powerful. Grieve and Nisbet spent the summer holidays of 1909 camping and cycling in Berwickshire, and Grieve called him infinitely more than a brother, a very spiritual familiar. Both were keen on international poetry, socialism, and evidently the geography of the borders. Nisbet was to start an honours English course when he became secretary, then president of the Fabian Society. He graduated from Edinburgh in 1914, was appointed to teach at George Watson's Academy, but instead joined the Royal Scots and was sent to France on the 17th of February, 1915. The Edinburgh Evening News of the 22nd of April reported that he'd been killed on the 13th of April. I'll finally quote briefly from a letter that Grieve wrote to George Ogilvie on the 20th of August, 1916. What Nisbet was to me although for long before his death we had not met nor corresponded. I cannot define. Infinitely more than a brother, very spiritual familiar. One of the many contrasting personalities in me was essentially Nisbet, thinking in me with his brain, working in me with his splendid sensuous vitality, reflecting upon the other personalities, part and parcel of the debating society, which is my mental life. He must not go undedicated. I have the very poem, for poem it must be without saying. It trembles on my tongue. At times, in semi-sleep, I can read it in the volumes of my subconsciousness, as from a printed page. Perfect, adequate. But I have not yet contrived to write it. Must I forever plan what I shall never execute? I am tortured worse than any Tantalus. That's a letter from 1916. Their encounter in the pages of the Scottish chapbook engenders an opening of inquiries. Revolutions in Ireland and Russia, as I said at the start, sexual repression, proto-feminism, diversity, uniformity, body and soul, and what belongs to Caesar, nothing, and leaving home behind. In this experimentation, a willing risk, not knowing will come of his writing and his publishing it, we might have a clue to MacDiarmid's method of investing emotional autobiography into depersonalized play. And I hope this kind of links back to questions that might have been raised by Patrick at the start about the inquiry, the nature of the play of the inquiry, and piecing together those early Scots poems. But also I want to bring into that sense of an emotional investment, which is personal, but has to be worked out, teased out, identified accurately. That element of play is neither conventionally engaged in a direct self-representation, nor explicable by psyche or character, but it suggests something else: the discovery of new ways of articulating emotional investment in the self-extinction of identifiable individualism. That would be, indeed, leaving home behind. Thanks.
Thank you, Alan, and thank you again to all of our other panelists. We've got about 25 minutes left, and we'd like to open up to questions from the floor now. Just a reminder that you can ask questions via the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom window, and thanks to you that have already done that. Or if you'd like to ask your question directly to our panel, you can click the raise hand button, and I'll try and figure out how to bring you into the conversation there. Looking at the Q&A, I think Scott's answered a few of the questions there, but there's one outstanding from Patrick Scott, who's interested in the visual carryover from the chapbook, from the Evergreen to the chapbook, and is asking, was this Christopher Greaves' initiative or McLivery's as older figure trying to ensure the respect interest of the next generation? Scott?
Yeah, don't know. I'm not sure I see a kind of huge carryover from Evergreen to chapbook. I mean, the Evergreen's a much more beautiful production, I think, than the chapbook was. And I don't know whose influence, I don't know if in terms of the later cover, whether Grieve went to McGilvray and asked for that to be done, or vice versa. I don't know if anyone else particularly knows. So I don't know how conscious, in a sense, some of those linkages are. I suppose what I was trying to say in my paper is some of those linkages might seem to undermine inadvertently some of the things that Greaves trying to do with the Scottish chapbook, but that they're there nonetheless. But I don't know if they were necessarily kind of deliberate or conscious moves by Grieve. And as I think there's quite a distance in some ways between you know, the look of the Evergreen and the chapbook, in my view, anyway.
Cool. Thank you, Scott. And Ben Jones-Williams has a question for Alan, just asking what the date was of the performance of Nisbet in the review that you mentioned. I think you're...
Yeah, okay. 1932. It was performed on the 23rd of December seems, 1932, and the review in the Daily Record was on the 24th of December.
Cool, thank you. And
Can I ask about, was MacDiarmid Grieve, was he there?
It seems not.
Right.
As I said, I'm indebted to the research that's online, done from from the Edinburgh University Library by, I think, Graham Eddy, and they're taking data from there, and those images come from that source. But the sense of it is that the correspondence from the director to MacDiarmid is reporting on the production, and it looks as though it was only a one-night production, one performance, just to see that he was experimenting with there were other short plays on that lineup at that time for that one evening's entertainment. But I thought it was curious, part because of the backdrop of the set that he imagined, also the kind of evocation of atmosphere that he was giving to what would have been a dramatic performance of this very wordy and, I guess to most literary scholars, not a particularly powerful piece of writing, and yet it seems to me quite fascinating.
Thank you. Alex Linklater, Alex, you've got a question in the chat. Your hand's also up, so I'm just going to click this allow to talk button, and you can, ask away. So hopefully this brings you in okay. Alex, you're muted at the moment, but if you unmute yourself.
Oh, hello.
Hi, Alex.
I could just see my name. Oh, no, there's a question for Scott. My screen is doing some funny things. So if you can hear me, I'll just ask the question to a blank screen with my name on it.
We can hear you.
It's the other contributors to the chat book. I just wondered, Scott, are they all verifiable? I mean, have you checked them all out?
No, I've not, and it's something I need to do. So I think you're right to be skeptical or to wonder that question. And I've wondered that too, but no, I've not been through all of them to verify whether we find that they might be Grieve pseudonyms. The poetry doesn't look like it, and I think my paper was glossing over quite a lot of things. There's so much to say about the chapbook. I mean, one of the things to do in much greater detail was to look at the various styles. If I was to turn this into a kind of journal article, then I would bring out a bit more the kind of nature of the stylistics, really, of the various contributions and see what that kind of turns up. But what I've kind of looked at, it doesn't look to me that somehow all the rest of those figures are Grieve writing poetry in a different name. No, but it's possible that one or two might be.
Cool, thank you, Scott. Alex, did you have any other questions, or was that the one?
No, that was the one.
Great. Oh, thank you. And then there's one more question in the Q&A at the moment that strikes me as something that might keep us busy for the next 20 minutes, in fact. How far is the poet's early output an attempt at a popular Scottish poetry? Or was it trying to walk a line between modernity and the popular? I don't know who would like to begin on that. Patrick, maybe. I think you may be muted.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
I have unmuted. Can you hear me? Yes.
Yes, we can hear you.
I think that the elitist agenda is fairly strong in Ernie MacDiarmid. I mean, Scott drew attention to that as a dimension of the Scottish chapbook. I think MacDiarmid is very conflicted about this. I mean, he would have liked recognition. He would have liked to be popular. He's sort of defensive about things, but there are particular writings of MacDiarmid that are aimed at a general audience. I mean, some of his Scots short stories, they're very Some of them are pitched at quite a high altitude, and others are really not pitched at a high altitude. I'm thinking of Murthome Hill. Okay, it's a hill, it's altitude, sorry. But I mean, it was published in, I think, the Scots magazine, which is a very popular, indeed populist organ. So there were particular things he did to turn a buck that would have been that sort of invited a general audience, but I really feel he wasn't looking for that kind of audience, or if he was obstructing his realization of the objective, if it was one.
I come in.
Sure.
I think that's very important, that there's a sense of MacDiarmid as a working writer, a working reporter, a journalist, someone who knows what magazines and what journals and what avenues of publication will publish, and how money could be made from publishing in certain places and not others, and by writing certain things and not others. And it doesn't invalidate, I mean, the value of Murthome Hill and it has its own fascination.
Well, indeed.
And at the same time, you know, things like the Waterside fits in so crucially with the whole vision of Langham and the vision of Clanalbyn, that the sense of it being part of that vision takes that text into that place. But it also means it could be published elsewhere as a short story of its own, or sketch of its own virtue, quite popularly accessible. And I think that's partly what he's working out in this bit, that Duffy is completely open about publishing for the people's friend. And Nisbet still is still unformed in terms of what he might actually do, if you're looking at him as a character in a drama, you know.
Can I change the subject?
Of course.
Just as I have unmuted, I just want to make one observation and to ask one question. The observation is in relation to Hardy. Frank Kermode and John Hollander made what has always struck me as a rather arresting claim in volume 5 of the Oxford Anthology of English Literature in the 1970s. They said that the early lyrics hid a lot of Hardy in their heather and thistle garments. That seems reductive, it seems Anglo-centric, and yet it also seems worth pursuing, you know, not dismissing out of hand. That's the observation. The question is to Scott, and it's a question I've long been interested in, but have never been able to find an answer to. How many copies of the Scottish chapbook were disseminated each month, each issue?
Yeah, no, I mean, John Corbett put some really interesting questions.
What sort of impact did it have?
You slightly broke up there,
Sorry?
but I think I got the gist of the question. And John Corbett put a kind of similar question into the chat, which I typed an answer to, about who were the subscribers, and your question about how many copies were sold, etc. I think kind of segs into that. I don't know the answers to those questions, or where to find the answers to those questions, actually. But I think that's kind of fascinating. What I was going to say, which pertains to this, and I think comes back to the popular modernist kind of question that was put before, I think also relates to journals, is there is a kind of vexed relationship there between, you know, walking a line of trying to disseminate work that's seen to be kind of avant-garde in some way, but actually using a lot of the mechanisms of kind of mass production that make that dissemination possible in the first place. So I think the movement in relation to scholarship on modern magazines will tend to suggest actually that they're not the elitist productions that they're often seen as, or even that their editors would like you to think they are. So MacDiarmid was very much, I think, kind of a master of publicity. I mean, he uses the chapbook to publicize an awful lot of the rest of what he is doing, and also, as I said in my talk, to ask continually for subscribers for the chapbook. The extent to which he's masking in some of those advertisements that it was a sinking ship kind of close to the start, you know, saying we're almost out of copies, etc., etc. I mean, there could be a real sense of bluff there, but I don't know specifically an answer to the question, and I would love to find out the answer to your question, Patrick, and also the question that John put in the chat as well about who the subscribers were, whether there's a subscriber list that's available. I've not seen one.
Thank you. Thank you.
Can I just go back briefly to, and it takes that is for Michael as well as Patrick. The Hardy question does seem to me really worth pursuing, and I agree with what you're saying, Patrick, about that reference. But at the same time, I mean, it's easy. I think it's given where we are with the whole network of Renaissance and revival and the discussions that have been happening. In a way, it's a little bit too tempting to neglect the fact that Hardy was such an important and highly valued writer for Pound as well as for Yeats, and in that era, he's. I mean, I think I remember it's Edward Garnett pointing out to a literary gathering, pointing out to Annie S. Swan of all people, that of all the company assembled for this big literary event in London, there's only one who's going to be remembered in the future, and that's Thomas Hardy. There he is. And the significance of that, I'm intrigued by, Patrick, your reference to Under the Greenwood Tree, and that sense of it, does seem a possible candidate for a book MacDiarmid Grieve might well have read and encountered and made use of in a more direct fashion. I don't know.
It seems to me that, you know, MacDiarmid is often misunderstood, but Hardy as a poet is even more characteristically misunderstood. I mean, he wrote a tremendous number of poems. Many of them are unremarkable, but the best lyrics are kind of explosively inventive. And some of them are really quite like MacDiarmid lyrics. I mean, things like the self-unseeing and the he, she, all of them, yea, you know, that famous one about the, I mean, there's a handful of, I mean, modernist is a word that gets bandied about, but Hardy is profoundly un-Victorian in his methodology as a poet, at some points at least.
I think that's really, really vital. And also to go back to what Michael was saying, the sense that I do remember just offhand about MacDiarmid's keenness to indicate Hardy's engagement with Cornwall, and his keenness to praise, although whether he read it, I don't know, the epic nature of the dynasts, this enormous and quite dense
there is, I think, a covert reference to the oxen in Garamscoile in Pennyweep, or whichever volume Garamscoile is in. And but even when you think of that poem, The Lonely Barton by Yondru Coombe, even the diction in Hardy can sometimes, you know, he's kind of interested in dialect and non-standard forms and blah blah blah. I say no more.
And that's noted in Memoriam James Joyce.
Just say thank you both for that, and yeah, the Kermode and Hollander thing I'd come across, but I suppose I didn't have time or didn't want to kind of put in a whole account of such criticism as there is. But yeah, I think it's interesting to pursue. And then when I was last in Edinburgh, I made notes from that hand list of what's in MacDiarmid's library, but I just, you know, at the time this wasn't a question that interested me. So for some reason I'd written down that Conversations at Mac's Gate from 1928, but I didn't note down whether MacDiarmid had any Hardy books in his library by the end. But in some ways that's not necessarily the you know, the crucial determining question anyway, because it would seem he kind of takes on books and has to sell them or loses them or whatever.
Thank you. There's another question that's popped up in the Q&A from Robert Hodgart. Says, opens a very simple biographical question. We have Alex's paper this afternoon, which is maybe going to suggest that any biographical question in relation to Grieve MacDiarmid is going to be a complex one. But yeah, since conscription in Britain was only introduced in 1916, if MacDiarmid joined up in 1915, then presumably he was volunteering, as so many young men did. If he was already a socialist, then why did he do that? Remembering that many socialists like Keir Hardie opposed fighting the war against their fellow workers in Germany. Was it because Nisbet had joined up, and did he volunteer before or after his friend's death? Alan, I think maybe for you.
Yeah, I guess it's really a question for Alex when later on this afternoon. The sense of it I have is that, yeah, he volunteered, and it was part of that engagement to, like so many other young men, simply buying into the military priority.
Mhm.
Yeah. Yeah.
No, thank you. We've got kind of 5 minutes left. Any other questions, either from the floor, if people want to put their hands up, or into the Q&A? I have a quick question, if no one else is stepping in. No.
Alex Linklater's raised his hand, I think.
Ah, hang on. Alex, if you
I've unmuted myself.
Fantastic.
It's one for Patrick.
Uh-huh.
Brilliant, of course, on the water gore. Describing, if I'm not being too crude, Patrick, how he's simply not trying to write about anything. He's drawing for the poem on his various sources and bringing it together. But is it not?
Just what I would just say about that particular thing is what he's doing is something he does quite characteristically. He is kind of reading the Lexis from Wilson against the hymn, and reading the hymn against the Lexis from Wilson. So it's not kind of about anything, but he's putting the two things together and to see what happens. And he does this time and time again in his poetry.
Yes, my question is, is the, if you like, and I think Alan may have alluded to this, is the autobiographical material, if that's the right way of putting it, does it not sort of seep in post facto? So you've got the process, whatever it is, the way he pulls together his sources, exactly like you described, but that doesn't mean there is no correlation with and resonance with events in the real world or events in his life.
That may well be true, but in relation to the water go, there seems to me to be no reason to read a reference to James Greaves' death into it. I mean, there's no evidential basis for connecting it to the death of James Greaves, in my view.
Well, just pause on it for a second, because the one that you picked up on, that the difference being the use of the word wild, the wild look.
Yes.
That has no reference in the later text, which has been cited as a kind of confirming text that it could be. So does the wild, where do you think the word wild comes from then?
The hymn is a hymn of faith and doubt. I mean, the doubt is very strong in Matheson's hymn, and there's the fear that the promise may be vain. Underlying both the hymn and the poem is the Genesis account of the bow being set in the sky, you know, after the deluge. So the addressee of the water gull, the dying addressee of the water gull, has a wild look because of consternation, you know, because he's coming up right against the answer to the either or, yes or no. is eternal life guaranteed, or is it not? That's where the wildness comes from.
Right.
But there's no suggestion of wildness whatever in the description of James Greaves' death. And notice in that description, also in the 1931 poem, he turned and gied a lang last look at pictures of my brother and me hung on the wall beside the bed. I've heard my mother say, you know, the speaker of the later poem isn't even a witness to this. It's just a reported anecdote by the mother. So all I'm saying is that I can see no reason to connect the death described in the Muckletoon poem of 1931 to the death described in the Watergaw. The only reason for suspecting that the Watergaw may be about James Greaves' death is the vehemence of MacDiarmid's own denial that this was so. And whenever he gets very strong on a point, you then say, "Oh, wait a minute, what's going on here?" But other than that, I mean, he wrote to Eddie Morgan, I think, about At My Father's Grave, and contrasted the treatment of death in At My Father's Grave to the Watergaw, again pointing out that the poem about his father's death actually, you know, is explicitly about it, and that this poem is not. Anyway, I say no more.
It's great.
I think it just seems to me that there's no basis for reading the Watergaw as an autobiographical poem. I mean, but you know, we have come from a period. I know it's a long time ago now, but a poem that I've always been extremely interested in is Shakespeare's The Phoenix and the Turtle. I don't call it The Phoenix and Turtle because that sounds like the name of a pub, but one of the commonplaces of recent commentary on The Phoenix and the Turtle is that Shakespeare wasn't interested in ideas. He was interested in other texts, and he constructed this poem out of Chester's poem and out of various other sources. But if you go back to the mid-century, all the commentary on The Phoenix and the Turtle is about the story of the Phoenix and Turtle eliciting a deep response in Shakespeare's emotions, and he poured all his passion into the quizzical rhetoric of the poem. I mean, everybody read poetry as an expression of psychodrama for a very long time, and like Ruth McQuillan's reading of the Watergaw is kind of a hangover of those days. We now laugh at these ideas that everything in Shakespeare. I mean, Kenneth Muir has this wonderful thing, a wonderful crazy thing about the Phoenix and the Turtle being a kind of a ground plan, a blueprint for all the plays that came after it, because Shakespeare was going to work out the conflict in his soul about the Dark Lady and the young man through exploring different aspects of it in different tragedies, comedies, and romances. I mean, it's utter nonsense, but it's kind of fascinating nonsense. But the nonsense derives from the innocent faith that the poem is some sort of provides some sort of window into the soul of the part. And I would say that the soul of Shakespeare is as inaccessible as that of C.M. Greaves, no more, no less.
And on that note,
before you go, for one brief moment to the previous question, just check my notes. Yeah, it's again an imponderable, I guess, but it is true, according to the sources, that the Edinburgh Evening News of the 22nd of April 1915 reported on Nisbet's death, and Greave enlisted in July 1915. So whether that's whether you can conclude from that a direct intentional motivation is perhaps ambiguous as well, but it is there's more ambiguity than certainty in a lot of these things, and that's where we are.
Great. Thank you very much, Alan and Patrick, Scott, and Michael, for your great papers this morning. Thanks to everyone that's joined us as well. We do have another session that starts in a little under 2 hours at 2 o'clock. If you want to come to that session, you'll need to sign up separately. There's links on our website. It's in the chat at the moment if you can get to that, if you haven't done so already. And you'll get a separate sign up and a separate link. So just make sure you're coming in on the right Zoom link this afternoon. But yeah, thank you again to all of our panelists for a great morning session, and we'll see you all this afternoon.